To the Voice to Parliament now, and in the final days of campaigning before Saturday's vote, representatives from both campaigns are being asked to consider the consequences of a no vote for the country. While the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is still maintaining the vote is winnable for the yes side, today saw leading Yes campaigner Noel Pearson declare love is in the air and that a quiet majority for the Yes side is forming. Leading No campaigner Warren Mundine, a vocal critic of The Voice, has toned down today his criticism of the Prime Minister. And the man, known as the father of reconciliation, Pat Dodson, has entered the discussion after the Labor senator has been treated recently for cancer. He urged Australians to support what he called a simple proposition.
There's absolutely nothing scary about that. There's nothing to be fearful of it. So if you're confused, look in the mirror and say, is that a good thing to do? What's the alternative? There's no alternative, except more of the same. If we're in the promised land that some people might want to suggest we're in, then why are we having such high rates of suicides? Why are we having so many of our kids being taken away and put into out-of-home care? Why is there so much domestic violence and internal violence within our societies? Why are we living in poverty? And that's what people are going to have to ask themselves on the 15th of October. Have we dealt with this legacy issue of denying the first peoples of this country, or have we actually owned up to it? And have we acknowledged that? And therefore we're not going to bequeath, we're not going to hand that legacy on to our future generations. We're going to put a stop to that lie, and we're going to set down a new foundation upon which we can build. The truth of our integrity as a nation is what's at stake here, the truth of that. And if we say no, then obviously that's going to be a very a matter for us to reflect upon. It'll reopen a scar and a sore that we thought we were trying to heal with the apology, with the advancements in the High Court, Mabo and Wick. Do you want to go forward or do you want to go backwards? Or do you want to do nothing? And do you want to look yourself in the mirror and have pride the next day, or have some doubts and uncertainties and even an increase in shame?
Dan Borsha hosts this very program and is the ABC's Voice referendum correspondent, and he joins us on the desk now. What a thing to see Pat Dodson without his trademark beard, almost unrecognisable, but still so articulate, so thoughtful, so patient, leading through the arguments with very much the cadence of a former Catholic priest, right? Talking to the congregation.
Yeah, well, it certainly was good to be with you, Ellen, and it was a moment, wasn't it, where we haven't heard from Senator Pat Dodson for so long because of his health, and as we heard at the start, the cancer that he's been battling. And in this final week, as he is now feeling a bit better, or albeit unable to travel, coming out and really laying out what he said was the case for yes, and in his words, the risk of no. And that if there is not the change that he says has been put forward by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, that he worries about not just the future, but integrity. He said, the truth of our integrity as a nation is what's at stake here.
And what do you think he meant by that?
I think he was speaking about the fundamental story we tell ourselves about who we are as Australians. That our founding document, our Australian Constitution, is missing references to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It is not missing references to race, of which there are 2 references in there about who can and can't vote, and of course the race power. And I think that he was talking about this bigger picture of inclusion, and he made in that speech a number of references going back to Mr Cooper from the 1930s. He talked about some of those key moments in Australia's Indigenous history of calls for equity and for equality. And he was really laying out there what he believes is the case for why this is the right next step. So when it comes to integrity, I mean, you have to remember that this is one of the Royal Commissioners from 1992. This is someone who is very familiar with integrity, or as was investigated at the time, the clear breaches of integrity when it came to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths in custody. So when he says that, that made me sit up and I went, wow, that was the moment of his speech for me.
And it really, you know, I think when you watch the news tonight, you'll see a lot of what he says about the consequences of no. But I just want to focus for a moment on the significance of yes. And he really boiled it down like that, didn't he? He said, for him, this is the question of recognition, and that for him, saying no as a country is perpetuating a falsehood, effectively supporting lies, an intolerable proposition. That Aboriginal people are the oldest continuous civilisation on the planet and are the original inhabitants of this nation. And that for him is at the heart of what we're going to be asked to vote on Saturday.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he made references to the intractable challenges that some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people face on a daily basis, and why he and so many other elders and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that were involved in that process outlined this is the pathway forward. And going back to the point you made at the start about his ability as an orator from perhaps his time at the pulpit, he said we're not in a Garden of Eden here when he was talking about the impact of colonisation. And that line particularly struck me because the day that Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price made those comments at the National Press Club as well, Catherine and I were having this very conversation. We were navigating through this in front of the nation. What does this mean? What are the impacts of this? And Catherine so very eloquently went back to those report after report after report that lays bare the truth of the impacts. I thought it was very powerful that Senator Dodson also made the point that colonisation had such a jarring immediate effect and has had an ongoing impact. He also said there has been good come from that in terms of governance structures, and some of the institutions is where I think that he was going with that. But he was saying it's not about one or the other. It's actually having a conversation means that you lay it all on the table and say there have been lots of really bad bits, there have been good bits. And that really where he was going with that is that his view is that the voice to Parliament is the next step in the good bits, if I can narrow it down in that way.
Catherine, quite a thing to see him, still with all the power of oratory, but stripped of that beard, and it was quite a thing to see him sitting down like that, wasn't it?
I think a lot of people who have been watching Pat Senator over the years were taken aback, actually. I was talking to someone who broke into tears to think that someone could be so ill that they would pull themselves out of what is effectively a sick bed and said, this conversation is so important and we've only got a few days left. I'm going to take it. I'm going to sit there and I'm going to speak for the heart and I'm going to connect to you, because this is a story about people, not polls. And I think that's what we've been seeing over the past couple of weeks, is we've been able to see the people step in. We've seen those incredible marches, tens of thousands of people giving up their weekend and saying, this is a really good idea. We can get behind it. We're seeing people giving up their weekends to go door knocking. We're seeing people willing to put themselves in positions of difficult conversations, because sometimes they are. People want to know more, that's fine. Have those conversations. But they're doing it because they can see something different. And even today, you know, I saw pictures coming in from my hometown, Alice Springs, where it was a call to action, took about 2 hours. It went out on Facebook and said, hey, we need to get together right now because they're here, they're talking about no, we need to tell everyone what we're saying yes. And basically what they wanted to say was, look at us now. There's been a lot of this conversation rooted in Alice Springs, and the women of Alice Springs, the people of Alice Springs, the Aboriginal people of Alice Springs stood up, 500 people en masse within the matter of an hour, and said, here we are, look at us. This is a fantastic thing. We want to work with you all. Can we truly move on? Yes, this is us. And again, when I think about what happened even yesterday at Uluru, we belong to the Kunia. My family belonged to the Kunia. It is one of the biggest stories for that. And my family was standing there, you know, my mum Margaret, my mum Rini, saying, please listen to us, please listen to us. Forget the polls, forget the media. Listen to these voices. When you see significant numbers of us standing together, this is who we are. Talk to us. This is not a hard thing. We can do this.
Rona, obviously Catherine's leaning into the positivity of those marches and the event in Alice Springs today. How are you feeling a couple of days out?
I love hearing about what's happening back home in Alice Springs. It gives me so much strength. I'm feeling really tired at the moment. I think that this referendum has created space for so much racism to be amplified en masse, and I'm so worried about what those narratives mean for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people right now, but also our young people in the future. I think the damage of those narratives is going to permeate for a really long time, and that scares me. And the potential of what this may look like in a few weeks scares me as well, but we don't know until we know. And I think there's been some really interesting discourse. I keep thinking about something that Teela Reid has been speaking about since 2020 around the time for an era of reckoning, that, you know, we need to move past this idea of reconciling relationships and call in and call out all those people living across Australia on stolen land that want to locate their responsibility. Yes has been a really simple ask, and I think our communities absolutely will continue to demand more regardless of the outcome, as we have for generations since the first moments of colonisation. And we need all people living across this continent to meet those demands, to back our visions for justice across all different movements and ensure that our futures create space for our young people to be strong in themselves and to be able to meet their aspirations and be heard on matters that affect them, but also to be able to drive solutions for the future.
Well, Martin, listen to this. There was a very obvious change in tone from leading No campaigner Warren Mundine. Today he was asked this morning whether the Prime Minister will be to blame if the referendum fails, and here was his answer.
Look, I don't want to try and get into the blaming people. What I want to do is if it loses, I just don't want him to come out and what he said this week and said, well, there's no really plan B. We've got to all come together and we've got to all work together to get things done. And now he just can't put it all in one basket. And the Australian people say reject it. We've got to get back together and fix it.
Martin. He's obviously, like everybody, thinking about the consequences of no, I would say. You have been very clear that you will be voting no. Do you worry about the consequences of the country of a no?
I do partly. I'd make this point. There's passionate arguments that have been put very openly and publicly on both sides. Some good arguments, a lot of emotion. There's been a bit of abuse, name calling. It's gotten a little passionate. There's only one group of people that haven't had a say yet, and that's the Australian electorate, the voters. Now, I can tell you after 22 years in politics, Australian voters are pretty smart. They've listened carefully to the arguments that have been put. They've been deluged with it on TV, radio, print. Just go out anywhere and meet with people. They're all talking about it. And I actually have quite a bit of confidence that Australian adults, they're all grown-ups, are able to take all that information in and make a judgment. Now, my point would be this. There'll be a decision on Saturday. It'll either be a yes or a no. And don't disrespect the Australian people's decision.
Why is that? Why is that a concern? I mean, we voted on the Republic, and that was divisive, not in the same way this is, but people continued to disagree the next day.
My point really is that I think whatever the outcome, if it's a resounding yes or a resounding no, or whatever it is, I think the winners of the debate have to be gracious in victory, and the losing side need to be humble and accept the people's judgment. And I guess the point that I'm making is the Australian people are actually pretty astute, and I think they've weighed all this up and they'll make a decision. Now, we don't know what that decision will be. Let's wait and see. But respect that decision. And I think what Warren Mundine was trying to say is we've got to come out of this, not name calling, not going over whose fault it was. We've got to listen to what the Australian people tell us when they vote, and then press the reset button. All the questions that Senator Dodson asked, they're all valid and they need an answer. Now, if the people decide the voice is not the answer, we need to find new answers because the problems are there and they need a solution.
And I think that's a really interesting point, because Warren Mundine was really saying there, after the Prime Minister said on the Insiders program that if this fails, there won't be a legislated model. And where the Prime Minister's going on that is that if this is the will of the people, then it will be clear that this is not the model to move ahead with. And it struck me that what Warren Mundine was saying there, and the tone of what he was saying, was really perhaps one of shock, that if there is nothing, then how as a nation do we deal with what campaigners on all sides have all admitted are the really intractable challenges? I don't think anyone can look at the Closing the Gap report and say, well, this is a partisan document that wouldn't be the case if it was one side or the other. Everyone agrees that what is happening now is not working. The point of disagreement is about what are the next steps forward. And now what we seem to be having the conversation, or where it's going, is that the Prime Minister should legislate a body if Australians say no. And that was the point Barnaby Joyce was making this morning as well, that you've got to go back to those conversations about that structure, which begs the question, is that going to then be the next political brawl that the Prime Minister didn't listen?
Can I talk to Catherine Little about this? This is what I don't understand. This voice proposal came out of more than a decade of consultations, constitutional conventions, former Prime Ministers and opposition leaders sending Aboriginal people out and saying, well, let's start again. If we were going to have a constitutional convention, let's not have old white guys with beards. Let's actually ask some Aboriginal people what they reckon. And it got whittled down through difficult processes up to Uluru. Lots of Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people with different ideas. And this is the outcome. Warren Mundine has spent the last few months trying to tear it down and is saying, what other ideas have you got? What does he mean? What other ideas?
I don't know. Look, I think you touched on something really important, because it wasn't only the decades of research that went under that sits behind this. It was also, when you look at who were in those rooms, particularly in the leadership positions, they've gone through multiple iterations. They've marched the streets. They've demanded treaty. They've demanded sovereignty, and they've tried negotiation, and yet nothing is truly budging. And someone like me lives and breathes the Closing the Gap statistics. Now,
you represent
I live and breathe
children,
That's
young
right.
people.
Absolutely. And when you look at those statistics, this is one of the most. This is when I say we've got to forget about the polls for a minute. Focus on people. Those statistics are people, and that is true. Those gaps are genuine. And again, if I go back to my homeland, and I think just even of my beautiful sons, my son Angus, who is now 22, played for a football team, an under-18s football team, that had 5 suicides in 6 months. 5 suicides from families like mine in 6 months. And that included Angus's best friend. And we will never, as a community, recover from something like that. How do you move on from that? There is something fundamentally wrong. We are genuinely talking about a real gap in life expectancy, a real gap in being able to communicate with people, a real gap in being able to influence those big, stuck-on, rusted-on policy barriers where you say, isn't it common sense, before you centralise all that service delivery in remote communities, that you talk to people about what that impact might potentially be? If there is no vehicles for you to get into town, if there's no telecommunications, if you can't use a computer, how do you get onto Centrelink? If the government comes in and says those jobs are gone, we've wiped those out, the only jobs now sit in the GBM office, they only sit in the health centre, they only sit in the schools. You cannot design your own jobs anymore, because we've decided that Canberra makes those decisions. Couldn't you ask Mob First? They'd have said, we'll help you do this, particularly in remote communities. You saw that and you only have to go to what happened to Uluru yesterday, where people said, we want to work with you, Mob. We just want to give you an opinion and an insight. We can see where those jobs are. We want to look after our babies. We just want this to stop. Can we just have a say?
Martin, when you hear something like that, what is your reluctance? And I know this is difficult, and I thank you for being part of this conversation, but what is your reluctance when you hear a plea like that about changing the Constitution to not only recognise Aboriginal people, but ensure they have a constitutionally guaranteed right to just have that say?
Yeah. look, no reluctance whatsoever in the sense that all of the problems that we've just heard of are pressing and need solutions. The question before the people on Saturday is whether amending the Constitution is going to solve all those problems, or whether it's going to be the solution or the beginning of the solution. I'm not sure if it will be. I think we need probably different solutions. I'm not an expert in what they will need to be, but the question before the people will be, do they want to amend the Constitution? Not do they want to solve the problem of Aboriginal suicide, closing the gap, the multitude of problems that we know the Aboriginal community face day on day, incarceration. All of those problems need a solution. But the question is amending the Constitution going to fix them?
Yeah.
And the people will make a decision on Saturday, and that's a different question.
We'll have we've got a guest standing by. Quick word from Angela, because I want to go back to Dan. Just a quick one, Angela.
Oh, look, I'd just say that, like, clearly, and I think Catherine's gone to it really succinctly about the importance of voice and involving Aboriginal people in these decisions. We know that. That's what all the evidence says. The reason it needs to be in the Constitution is because time and time again we've had these bodies that have listened and that have consulted. We have one now with the Coalition of the Peaks. Every time governments don't like what they hear, they abolish those organisations and they stop listening. And for Aboriginal people to front up again, to create a voice, all the work that is involved in that, in a legislated voice that can just be wiped out once again by a government that doesn't like what it hears, is unreasonable, right? This is around trust, and it's about putting the trust in Aboriginal people and giving them that voice. And I really am hopeful still that we see the Australian people voting yes on Saturday.
Noel Pearson, very hopeful today. Pat Dodson said he's very hopeful today when pressed on what no would mean on Sunday, when you and I will sit in this room and talk again, regardless of the result. He said, well, we will need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country. We will really need to face up to our relationship to one another.
Yeah, I think that's the case now, regardless of the outcome, given what we have seen happen this year, and everyone's kind of made reference to the tone of the debate, some of the vitriol, some of the really vile racism. I'm getting text messages almost every day about things that are being said and done to people, including homes being vandalised because they had Yes campaign material in their front yard. There is clearly going to be a need for a conversation or some mechanism to start to navigate through what happened this year and what does it say about us as Australians, and where does it say, like, what indication does it give us about where we're going next? There were two quotes that I just wanted to bring you before I go. Pat Dodson today saying, are we going to be at the table or are we going to be picking up crumbs? That I thought was particularly profound in terms of his life experience and the way that he framed this conversation. And Warren Mundine saying that we really need to start the healing, and that was certainly a tone of what he was saying in that interview on the ABC this morning. And it seems like there were these red threads that were running through all of these key speakers across both sides today. And maybe this is kind of what's going to be in play for the final couple of days, is this reckoning around where we are right now.
Thanks so much, Dan. It's just always great to have these conversations with you on air.
Thanks, Al.
You've been such guidance for us all, such leadership in this organisation through this whole year, that we can turn to you, talk to you when you've got so many other demands on you, and the quality of the reporting that you've done, the fairness of it has struck us all. It's been monumental. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much.
Dan Boucher, the ABC's Voice referendum correspondent, and Jan will join me on Sunday night for a special post-vote edition of The Drum, 6:30 p.m. on ABC TV and iView. And if this topic has raised any issues for you, please call Lifeline 13 11 14 or 13 YARN on 139276.